Tonight, you're not here to learn quickly. You're not here to memorize dates or follow arguments or hold on tightly to every detail. Tonight, you're simply stepping into a different pace of thought, a slower one. Imagine a city at rest, not silent, but softened. The noise of the day has faded, and what remains is the quiet movement of minds at work. This is Baghdad, more than 1,000 years ago. The air is warm, the streets are dimly lit, and in certain corners of the city, lamps are still burning long after sunset, not for trade, not for spectacle, but for knowledge. Tonight, we are entering the House of Wisdom. You don't need to picture it as a single building. It was more than that. It was a rhythm, a culture, a way of treating learning as something worthy of patience and care. Inside, there is no urgency. No one is rushing. Manuscripts are opened slowly. Pages are turned deliberately. Ink dries under steady hands. Some are translating, some are copying, some are simply reading, absorbing words written centuries before them. There is no audience, no applause, no performance, only attention. If your mind begins to wander, that's perfectly fine. This is not a story that demands effort. It unfolds whether you follow every step or simply let the atmosphere carry you. The House of Wisdom did not come into existence by accident. It emerged in a time when the pursuit of understanding was considered an act of respect toward the world, toward knowledge itself, and toward the idea that truth is approached slowly. Baghdad was chosen carefully, built between rivers, connected by trade routes, positioned where ideas could travel as easily as goods. By day, the city was busy and alive. By night, something else happened. Scholars gathered after sunset, not because they were forced to, but because the night offered what the day could not. Stillness, the absence of distraction, a kind of quiet that allows thought to deepen. Candles flicker beside stacks of parchment. Astronomical charts rest near medical texts. Philosophy sits beside mathematics, and language beside law. No subject is isolated. Everything is allowed to speak to everything else. This was not learning for speed, it was learning for endurance. Ideas were expected to last, to be revisited, to be corrected, to mature. Tonight, as you listen, you are not required to stay awake. You're invited to drift through rooms filled with books, through corridors lined with careful work, through a civilization that believed the mind does its best thinking when it is unhurried. We'll move gently from the city itself to the people who worked here, to the way knowledge traveled, and the quiet habits that shaped an entire age. For now, just remain here, in the soft light, among the manuscripts, at a time when learning was not loud but luminous. Beyond the walls of the House of Wisdom, the city itself was part of the work. Baghdad was not an old city, but it was built with old understanding. It rose between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, whose slow movement had carried people, goods, and ideas for centuries before the city ever existed. By day, these rivers were busy. By night, they became something else, quiet paths of connection. Boats arrived without ceremony. Manuscripts changed hands without announcement. Knowledge moved without urgency. This was not accidental. Baghdad was placed where worlds already met: Persian, Greek, Indian, Arab, not to dominate them, but to listen. Trade routes crossed here, not as straight lines, but as gentle convergences. What arrived in the city did not have to shout, it only had to endure the journey. And when the sun set, the city softened. Shops closed streets thinned. The pressure of the day loosened its grip. For scholars, this mattered. The night offered something rare, time without interruption. During the day, learning competed with life. At night, it stood alone. Candles were cheaper than distraction. Silence was more abundant than space. Inside rooms like this one, texts were approached slowly. A page was not skimmed, it was weighed. A sentence was not rushed past, it was allowed to settle. The scholars of Baghdad did not believe that understanding arrived suddenly. They believed it accumulated. A word clarified another word. A paragraph illuminated a chapter. A book reshaped a lifetime. This is why learning flourished here. Not because knowledge was rare, but because attention was protected. The house of wisdom did not separate disciplines, it gathered them. Mathematics did not sit apart from language. Astronomy did not exclude philosophy. Medicine listened to observation as much as theory. The night made this possible. In the quiet hours, no subject demanded priority. A translator might move from a Greek medical text to an Arabic poem without feeling he had changed worlds. Everything belonged, and because everything belonged, nothing was hurried. The city itself learned this rhythm. Homes adapted, courtyards softened sound, rooms were arranged for reading, not display. Even conversation changed at night. Voices lowered, arguments slowed, certainty gave way to curiosity. Baghdad became a center of knowledge, not because it sought to be impressive, but because it allowed thought to arrive intact. Nothing here needed to be proven quickly. Ideas were permitted to arrive incomplete and leave refined. As you listen, you don't need to hold on to these details. Let them pass like the rivers outside, steady, quiet, continuous. Because what mattered most was not what was learned in a single night, but what could be returned to again and again without resistance. And so, within this city of water and night, the house of wisdom became more than a place. It became a habit. The house of wisdom was never meant to impress from the outside. It did not announce itself with towering architecture or grand ceremony. Its power was quieter than that. Inside, the work was simple in appearance and immense in consequence. There were no lecture halls in the way we imagine them now, no raised platforms, no rows of listeners waiting to be addressed. Instead, there were rooms, tables, shelves, floor cushions worn soft by years of use. This was not a place of performance. It was a place of continuity. Some came here to translate. They worked slowly, moving line by line between languages, careful not to replace meaning with speed. A single sentence might take an entire night, not because it was difficult to understand, but because it deserved precision. Others came to copy texts. They did not think of this as repetition, they thought of it as preservation. Every copy page was another chance for an idea to survive longer than its author. Ink was mixed deliberately. Pens were trimmed patiently. Mistakes were corrected without frustration. The goal was not perfection, it was reliability. There were also readers. They did not skim. They did not search for conclusions. They read the way one listens to something that might speak again. A reader might pause for minutes at a time, not because they were distracted, but because the words had reached a place that required silence. Knowledge here was not consumed, it was kept company. What made the House of Wisdom remarkable was not the brilliance of any single individual, but the environment it sustained. No one worked alone for long. Texts passed between hands, ideas were shared without ownership. Corrections were offered without offense. A translator might consult a physician. A mathematician might ask a poet about the weight of a word. The night made these crossings natural. There was no schedule pressing them forward, no demand to conclude before morning. If something remained unresolved, it could wait. This patience shaped everything. Disagreement did not need to harden. Questions did not need immediate answers. In the house of wisdom, uncertainty was allowed to exist without being treated as failure. And so knowledge deepened, not by force, but by exposure. The same text read in different nights revealed different meanings. A passage that seemed clear one evening might feel incomplete the next. This was expected. Learning was understood as something that changed with the reader, and the night, with its softness, its reduced demands, its long hours, made room for that change. You might imagine a lamp burning low beside a manuscript, not bright enough to dominate the room, only enough to hold a small circle of light. Within that circle, a person reads. Outside it, the city rests. And in that balance, between light and darkness, between effort and ease, the work continues, not loudly, not urgently, but faithfully. Knowledge in Baghdad did not move quickly, it moved carefully. It passed from hand to hand, not as information, but as responsibility. Before a text ever reached the house of wisdom, it had already traveled far. Some arrived by river, wrapped in cloth, protected from water and sun. Others came across land, carried by merchants who understood that books were not merchandise in the usual sense. They were entrusted items. When a manuscript arrived, it was not rushed into use. It was examined, compared, sometimes set aside until another version appeared. Discrepancies were expected. A translator knew that no two texts said the same thing in exactly the same way. The work, then, was not to copy blindly, but to listen across languages: Greek, Persian, Sanskrit, Syriac. Each carried its own assumptions, its own rhythm of thought. Translation was not substitution, it was negotiation. A word in one language might require an entire phrase in another. A concept might need explanation before it could be carried forward intact. This is why the work happened slowly. Speed introduced distortion. Patience preserved meaning. Once translated, a text entered another phase of its life. Copying. Paper had begun to replace parchment, changing everything. It was lighter, easier to produce, more forgiving of error. This allowed ideas to spread without losing their form. Copyists worked quietly, often late into the night when the city's demands were at their lowest. Their task was not creative, but it required discipline, a steady hand, a steady mind, a willingness to repeat without resentment. Margins were left intentionally wide, not for decoration but for notes. A reader might add a clarification, another might raise a question, a third might correct an earlier mistake. In this way, a book became a conversation that stretched across generations. Libraries were not warehouses, they were crossroads. Texts circulated, they were borrowed, returned, recopied. A scholar might work from memory, then return to the page to test what remained. Knowledge here was not stored for prestige, it was stored for use. And because it was meant to be used, it was made accessible, not simplified, but shared. The night made this circulation possible. Without interruption, without pressure, ideas could move freely. A student might sit beside a teacher, not asking for answers, but watching how questions were held. A disagreement might pause, not end. A conclusion might remain provisional for years. This was not inefficiency, it was resilience, because ideas that moved slowly tended to last. And as this text multiplied, they did not remain in Baghdad. They traveled again along rivers, across deserts, into new cities. Each time they arrived somewhere new, they changed slightly. A note added here, a correction there, but the core remained because it had been given time. As you listen, you don't need to track each movement. Let the idea settle instead. That knowledge, when treated gently, has a way of finding its path, not through force, not through urgency, but through care. For those who worked in the house of wisdom, the night was not an escape from responsibility. It was where responsibility found its proper shape. The day belonged to necessity, appointments, obligations, interruptions. The night belonged to intention. Scholars did not arrive hurried, they came prepared to stay. Some brought their own lamps, others relied on shared light. A place near a window was preferred, not for the view, but for the feeling of openness it gave the mind. There was no bell to announce the beginning of work, no signal to mark its end. Each person learned to recognize their own moment of readiness. A night might begin with reading, then shift quietly into writing, or it might begin with listening to another reader, to a translation being spoken aloud, to the sound of words testing themselves in a new language. Conversation was unforced. Questions emerged naturally. Answers, when they came, were offered gently. No one competed for attention. What mattered was clarity, not recognition. Many scholars followed simple routines. They read before they wrote. They copied before they commented. They returned to difficult passages on multiple nights, allowing understanding to grow without pressure. Sleep was respected but not indulged. A short rest was often enough to return with steadier focus. The body was not treated as an obstacle to learning but as its companion. Food was light, conversation was measured, excess was avoided, not from austerity but from experience. It was understood that a restless body rarely supported a settled mind. Some nights passed without progress. A text resisted interpretation. A translation felt incomplete. A question remained unanswered. These nights were not considered failures. They were part of the rhythm. Learning was not expected to perform on demand. It was allowed to unfold. There were also nights of quiet satisfaction. A sentence finally aligned. A concept revealed its structure. A passage found its proper words. These moments were not celebrated loudly. They were acknowledged, then set aside to be tested again later. Nothing was trusted immediately. What gave the House of Wisdom its strength was not brilliance, but consistency. Night after night, the same core was applied, the same patience returned. Over time, this accumulated, not as fame, not as spectacle, but as depth. And as the hours passed and lamps burned lower, the city outside remained still. The scholar did not feel alone. Others were awake elsewhere in the city, engaged in similar work. Different texts, different questions, the same quiet commitment. In this way, the night became a shared space, a time when effort was softened and attention could remain without strain. If you find your thoughts slowing here, that is natural. This was the pace learning took when it was meant to last. As the night deepened, the work of the House of Wisdom did not exist in isolation. It was part of a wider rhythm that moved quietly through the city. Beyond the rooms of manuscripts and lamps, Baghdad breathed at a slower pace. Students made their way through narrow streets, carrying tablets or folded pages, repeating passages softly to themselves so the words would settle before sleep. Some were young, others had studied for years. At night, their differences mattered less. They gathered where light was available, in courtyards, near mosques, in private homes where learning was welcomed. A student might listen more than speak. Another might ask a question that stayed unanswered until the following week. There was no urgency to complete a curriculum. Knowledge was not measured by speed but by familiarity. Calligraphers worked nearby. Their nights were shaped by repetition. Each letter required balance. Each line required restraint. A hand that rushed revealed itself immediately. So the calligrapher learned to slow the breath, to steady the wrist, to let form emerge without force. This was not separate from scholarship. Clear writing preserved clear thought. In other quarters of the city, astronomers looked upward. The night sky over Baghdad was generous, dark enough to reveal detail, familiar enough to invite patience. Charts were consulted, observations were recorded. The stars did not need to be explained quickly. They returned each night, unchanged by human concern. Physicians reviewed notes from the day, symptoms observed, treatments adjusted. Medicine, too, benefited from night. Without interruption, patterns became visible. What had been unclear in daylight sometimes aligned after hours of quiet review. Teachers rested or prepared for the next day by revisiting older texts. Some read not to discover something new, but to remember something essential. The city did not sleep all at once. It rested in layers. Light receded from public spaces and gathered in private ones. From a distance, Baghdad at night appeared calm, almost still, but within that stillness, a tension remained alive. No one felt the need to announce what they were doing. Learning did not require witnesses, it required continuity. This is what gave the city its depth. Not a single institution, not a single generation, but a shared understanding that thought was something to be returned to regularly, like prayer, like rest. As hours passed, some lamps went out, others remained. The night did not insist that everything be finished. It allowed effort to taper naturally. And when sleep arrived, it was not an interruption. It was part of the cycle, a pause before returning again. What gave the House of Wisdom its strength was not expansion, it was restraint. The work that happened here was never designed to impress quickly. It was designed to remain. Knowledge was not treated as something to be conquered, but something to be accompanied. Ideas were given time to reveal their limits. Errors were expected. Corrections were welcomed. Nothing needed to appear complete on the first encounter. This attitude shaped the civilization around it. Learning did not belong to a single class. It was not confined to youth. It was not something one finished. It was something one returned to. The night made this return possible. By removing urgency, it restored proportion. A difficult question did not need to be resolved immediately. A disagreement did not require victory. Understanding was allowed to remain in motion. This is why knowledge endured here, not because it was guarded aggressively, but because it was cared for patiently. Texts survived because they were copied carefully. Ideas survived because they were discussed gently. Institutions survived because they adapted without abandoning their core. The House of Wisdom did not depend on a single ruler, a single generation, or a single method. It depended on habit. Night after night, the same quiet commitments returned. to read attentively, to write carefully, to listen before correcting, to pause before concluding. These habits shaped minds that could hold complexity without strain, and minds like these build structures that last. The influence of this approach extended far beyond Baghdad. Texts traveled west and east. Methods were adopted, sometimes without acknowledgement, but the deeper influence was harder to trace. It lived in the way problems were approached, in the way disagreement was tolerated, in the way patience was valued over certainty. Civilizations often measure power by speed, by expansion, by volume. The House of Wisdom measured it differently. Power was the ability to remain attentive without exhausting the mind, to stay curious without becoming restless, to move forward without abandoning care. This is why the night mattered. It protected attention. It allowed effort to be sustainable. It reminded those who worked here that understanding deepens when it is not forced. As the hours moved toward morning, work naturally slowed, not because it had failed, but because it had reached a resting point. A book closed, a lamp dimmed. What remained unfinished was not lost, it waited. As the night neared its end, there was no announcement, no signal that the work was complete, only small signs. A manuscript returned to its place, a pen set down, a lamp adjusted lower. The House of Wisdom did not close abruptly, it softened. Those who remained did so quietly. There was no sense of loss in stopping. What had not been finished was not abandoned, it had simply reached a pause. Outside, the city remained calm. Baghdad did not rush toward morning, it allowed the night to complete its own arc. This was understood. That effort, when sustained, requires rest. That attention, when cared for, does not need to be forced. Knowledge was not something that demanded possession. It was something that returned when invited, and so the night released those who had worked within it. Some slept briefly, some rested their eyes before returning home. Others remained awake, not working, but simply sitting with the quiet. Nothing was required of them now. The work would return another night. It always did. This was the true strength of the House of Wisdom, not the volume of books, not the number of scholars, but the confidence that understanding does not disappear when we step away, that it waits. As you listen now, you do not need to hold on to anything you have heard. There is no lesson to extract, no conclusion to secure, only an atmosphere that once existed and in many ways still does. A way of learning that moved slowly, that respected limits, that trusted time. If your thoughts have become quiet, that is enough. If you are drifting, that is also enough. The night has done what it needed to do. And like the lamps in the House of Wisdom, this story does not end sharply. It dims.